Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you. I'm Michael Rosenthal, the acting director of the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. And I want to welcome you all to our annual Schwartz-Reisman Graduate Student Conference in Jewish Studies. This event focuses on one of the crown jewels of our program, the Collaborative Graduate Program, which brings advanced students from across the university into the Center for Jewish Studies and into dialogue with our discipline and its remarkable faculty. The conference is a chance for our students in this program to showcase their work and contribute to our discussions. And it's also an opportunity to bring scholars from outside of the University of Toronto and let us learn about their cutting edge work. This year, we've invited a panel of scholars to reflect on the theme of working at the intersection of Jewish studies and Africana studies, excuse me. Before we begin this exciting event, allow me to thank the many people who have worked hard to make it possible. Without Professor Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolf Chair in Holocaust Studies, and our graduate program director, this conference would not have come to fruition. And two graduate students, Caitlyn Hamblin Ewell and Jamal Mansour, have organized the conference program. Our staff have also played an essential role. Galina Weissman, our graduate program administrator and business officer, Natasha Richichi-Fried, our events coordinator, and Sebastian Buccioni, our new events assistant. The center is also deeply grateful for the support of all our donors, especially Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz, Ira Gluskin, and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin. And finally, let me thank all the participants in this event whose intellectual energy and contributions is at the core of all we do at the center. Let me turn things now over to Caitlyn Hamblin Ewell. She's a PhD student in philosophy, writing a dissertation on Kant, and she's been a student in the collaborative graduate program at the Center for Jewish Studies since 2018, and she's one of the co-organizers of this conference. Thank you, Caitlyn.
Hi, thank you, Michael. Okay, I'm so happy to see that so many people were able to make it today, especially early in the morning. And I know that a lot of us are feeling Zoom fatigue lately, or at least I am, right? I know that meetings or conferences on Zoom can feel especially tiring, but I'm so happy to see that we're all making an effort to come together in whatever ways we can, right, in order to celebrate the interesting and diverse work that's going on here at the center. So thank you. So I just want to make a few remarks on why Jamal and I chose this theme for the conference. Right, so we wanted to choose a theme which is, you can say, relevant to our current situation, and yet at the same time, we have all had a very hard 13, almost 14 months, and we're all well aware of how much this time at home has sucked, right? So we didn't want to focus on isolation, loneliness, and all the negatives that we've been experiencing, but rather we wanted to focus on our abilities to overcome trauma and hardship in a manner that helps us move forward. So in light of these aims, the themes of resiliency and hope make a lot of sense, I think. But someone can ask, why humor? Right? COVID and the losses people have suffered and the isolation we've experienced is no laughing matter, and we get that, right? Humor, however, doesn't need to diminish one's experiences of grief or trauma. And to be able to laugh, especially in dark times, we think is a way to take back some power, right? And to assert oneself as a person or an agent. And humor, we think, also helps to connect one another, or us to each other, right? When we laugh together, even in these times when we're separated and can only interact via a screen, it still manages to strengthen our bonds, right? In a way that wouldn't really be possible otherwise. So humor in dark times then seems to be a form of resiliency and just as useful a resource as hope. So just a couple notes on the keynote panel before I turn things over. We put together this keynote panel because we're interested in seeing how Jewish studies and the study of Jewish experiences can enter into a meaningful dialogue with Africana studies, right? So highlighting the ways in which Jewish studies have and can inform and be informed by Africana studies and critical race theory is important for many reasons, right? One being that it should help us reflect on our notion of Jewish identity and help us see that this concept is in fact quite broad, right? And extends beyond the usual commonly held assumption that being Jewish is connected to one's European ancestry. And this is a theme we'll see at the end of the day in Sarah Jacoby Harris's documentary. But another reason it's crucial, I think, to expand the scope of Jewish studies is that it would seem that a common aspect of social domination and oppression is the attempt to isolate the disempowered from one another by impeding this kind of discourse and mutual recognition. So the solidarity that can arise from these sorts of discussions can be a means of countering this oppression as we gain power when we realize we have allies and shared interests. Okay, so one note just on how the day is going to unfold, and especially how the Q&A session will work online. Since Zoom is, like I said, especially fatiguing, we have worked in many breaks during the day, so you can have a few minutes, right, to step away, grab something to eat, or just rest for a little bit. And we'll always make sure to have a break after the talk and before the Q&A session, because we find this is especially helpful, especially for students, to kind of take a second to reflect on the talk and to form their question. Okay, once the Q&A session starts, if you have a question, just type it into the chat, and our chair moderators will do their best to get to every question. CGS students, if you would like, you can simply note that you have a question in the chat, and when our moderator calls on you, you can speak over your microphone if you prefer. Just a note, sometimes the chair may have to lump your question in with several other similar questions, just to make sure that we can get to everyone's question. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our chairs for the keynote panel. Dr. Doris Bergen from the History Department, who will be chairing the talks, and Yu Wang from the Comparative Lit Department, who will be chairing the Q&A session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Caitlyn, for the really meaningful opening remarks that set us up so beautifully for the day. I also want to just add right up front a special word of thanks to Caitlyn, Hamblin, Ewell, and to Jamal Mansour, our fantastic graduate co-chairs of this conference. The two of you have shown so much creativity and generosity, and I also have to say, we laughed a lot in our meetings. So thanks so much. So I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speakers and saying a few more words about the topic of our panel. So we have four really outstanding speakers, panelists today, 3 historians, 1 literature expert, all of whom are themselves working at the intersections of Jewish studies and Africana studies in very different ways. We're going to hear first, the order's a little different than you see there. We're going to hear first from Professor Bryan Roby from the University of Michigan, then Dr. Roni Mikel Arieli from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, then Professor Danielle Christmas, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then Professor Kira Thurman, University of Michigan. And I want to say a huge welcome to all 4 of you. I also want to note that the bibliographies, detailed bibliographies of all our speakers are in the program. Sebastian posted the link, so we won't take up precious time reading their extremely impressive CVs, but I please encourage you all to do so. I want to also just take a moment to introduce and add to the introduction Yu Wang, PhD student in comparative literature and Jewish studies, and a former graduate conference co-chair member of that elite group. And as Caitlyn mentioned, you will moderate the question and answer. So our topic of our panel fits, as Caitlyn again suggested, and Mikel Rosenthal too, in our current times in such, I think, an important and urgent way. You know, if you think back, for those of you who were at our panel, at our graduate conference last year, almost exactly a year ago, you know, in the sort of early stages of COVID, so much has happened since then. And one way to sort of, I guess, sum up some key things that have happened is to think it was just a few weeks after our panel that George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And it was just very recently that the killer was convicted on all 3 accounts earlier this month. But to sum up the past year that way is also in some way perhaps too easy. I don't need to tell you that the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis was not the beginning of anti-Black racism, of deadly systemic racism. I don't have to tell you that the conviction of a white police officer for his murder was not the end of a process of reckoning with racism. Thinking about our conference and our keynote, I talked to a lot of graduate students, colleagues, our co-chairs, our acting director, our staff at CJS, and we all knew that we wanted to engage and acknowledge the challenges to Jewish studies as a field and to our program right now by being part of a moment of reckoning with systemic racism. We also knew that we didn't want to retreat in a kind of easy or lazy way to a position of, oh, well, there's no one working on that, or it's too bad there's not more diversity or inclusion in our field. Instead, what we really thought about is how can we take this opportunity both to accept that challenge and to see the real work that is being done in our field, and to celebrate and recognize the scholars who are working in such different ways at that intersection, intersections between Jewish studies and Africana studies, fields that are adjacent, overlapping, connecting, that can be compared, but that are also sometimes contiguous, sometimes the same. Our panel today, we hope, is going to challenge us and also inspire us, not only to listen and learn to the fantastic work that our colleagues are doing in Jewish studies and in fields adjacent, but also to look again in new ways at our own work. What are we missing? What are we neglecting? What have we overlooked? Okay, so here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to hear first from all 4 of our panelists, telling us about their own current work, one directly after the other. First, as mentioned, Professor Roby, Dr. Mikel Arieli, Professor Christmas, Professor Thurman. Then I'll say a few words, we'll change direction for a second round, then we'll take the break and the question and answer. So please join me in a hearty welcome to our panelists, starting with Professor Bryan Roby.
Thanks for that introduction. So I'd like to start with something that I was thinking of just now. And oftentimes there's a question of, well, what are the intersections between, let's say, Black and Jewish studies? And oftentimes my point of departure is, what are not the intersections in that sense, right? How can they not be, very much tied in with each other? And, it's a question that was posed, in the late 19th century by people in the early 20th century by people like Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois, and of course Frantz Fanon as well, who, when he conceptualizes what is Black anti-racism, he very much, all of them really understand it as something in which, the Jewish question, in a sense, is very much tied into, where Fanon, points out this idea that, if someone, is anti-Semitic to someone, then just watch out, because for sure that they're anti-Black in that sense, right? And vice versa. So that's something that was just popping in my mind, and I'll try to keep my presentation short. And what I'll do, I'll be fairly informal, if you haven't noticed that already, and just kind of give you a little bit of background and a slight taste of something that I'm working on currently. I am a historian, but I'll talk a lot about poetry, not from a literary perspective, but just kind of like using it as a kind of jump off point to understand questions of Blackness within Israel in particular. And so this first image here, I really like it. I kind of put it together, and it's like all the different types of Black representation within Israeli Jewish society in that sense. All of these people here are artists and cultural performers. One's a comedian, and they all represent some type of Blackness for Jews within Israel. Do I just click this? I'm clicking it. There we go. So this is a bit of a rundown of my book. I'm not going to go through each chapter, but really, at the heart of my research, I kind of deal with this question of, if we say that race is a social construct, then that means someone has constructed this. So what are the building blocks that created certain racial constructs within a society? And then what can Israel, as a relatively new society, teach us about how racial constructs are formed and changed over time and place? So I kind of move beyond the question of, are the Jews a race? And really delve deeper into understanding those processes involved with creating a Black-white color line between Jews and amongst Jews, mostly in Israel, but it also has a lot of, you can see a lot of like echoes within the American Jewish experience as well. And I focus on the 19th until the 21st centuries. So it's kind of a long durée historical intervention in some ways. And one of the main things that I'm looking at is this kind of intersection between race and gender expression within the Middle East. So I'm hoping to kind of, make a contribution to both Middle East studies as well as Black and Jewish studies in a larger way. And I focus on Afro-Asian Jews, Jewish migrants to Israel and their descendants in a sense. So something to kind of frame it, and I'm sure other people, have other ways of framing, what does Blackness mean? What is, throughout the world and things like that. But the one kind of quote that always sticks with me in terms of framing global Blackness is that we really do, as members of society in general, as well as scholars to a certain extent, have to get away from trying to find Blackness on the body. Because it's, it turns into this very problematic essentializing process or procedure of, okay, well, they don't look Black because of what? Because of skin color, because of the shape of their nose, because of this and that. And that just falls into this like very racist trope that was like very prevalent in the early 20th century throughout the Western world in some ways. On the left-hand side, there's a group in France called 30 Shades of Black, and they do an Afro-Femme march in a variety of different cities in Europe. And, they do kind of represent this idea that, there's a diversity of bodies that claim Blackness as an identity, and that Blackness is very important for them. So that's just a little, and then it just ended. Uh-oh. Sorry, a little technical difficulty here. I'm sharing. And all right, well, it's refusing to show you the rest of my presentation, so I'll just do it this way. There we go. So just a little bit of background. Who I'm talking about in terms of Afro-Asian Jews are called Mizrahim, as opposed to Ashkenazi Jews, who are mostly European origin Jews. In the early 20th century, we have Jews from as far west as Morocco to as far east as Singapore, India, Pakistan, Iran, and places like that. With the establishment of the State of Israel, that sort of changes. Whereas the majority, after several decades, from 48 until the 70s, the majority of Jews in these communities actually move to France and the UK, as well as Israel, Palestine, and that changes their racial dynamics in a sense. Depending on where they're living, their race changes in a lot of different ways. Which is really important to take into account. So like, for instance, in the American experience, North Africans are white and Caucasian, but that is not the case in France, for instance. And so we have the same families with different kind of racial dynamics and identities in that sense. So in the Israeli case, the majority of Afro-Asian Jews in the 1950s and 60s were placed into transit camps called Mabarot, where they were settled, and these were literally tent camps that were meant to be resided in for a couple of months at most, while European Jews oftentimes were almost immediately resettled into a nice apartment or something like that. Afro-Asian Jews were sometimes, kind of made to live in these camps for, almost a decade in many cases. And that actually is one of the kind of main sticking points, and something that, is a kind of a historical period for Israeli society in which, there's a lot of bitterness and memory, combined, kind of within that memory for Mizrahi or Afro-Asian Jews. One thing I do want to point out is that, so this is a map of the kind of throughout the country, where these different transit camps were put into place. This is a map that I made. And you can see, well, you may not be able to see because it's not a dynamic map, but I'll just point out that most of the camps were placed in what's called the periphery of the country. Tel Aviv, for instance, which is the economic and social capital of the country, almost none were there. So it's in a little bit hard to see, but they're in a ring around them. So Tel Aviv being a kind of fairly white Ashkenazi center. And that has continued, until today. So I received some data from the Central Bureau of Statistics, and I kind of visualized it. And you can see here, so in the areas where it's like kind of light green, that's a slight majority of Afro-origin Jews who live there. The places in red are where there is a solid majority, like 80 to 100% of Afro-Jews. And we can see here where there's no color, this is where Ashkenazim live. And it kind of repeats the same thing that was going on in the 1950s. And so it kind of like reinforces this, or helps to show or demonstrate this idea that there is segregation in multiple different ways within Israeli society. And that also applies to some Jewish populations. I'm not going to get into this, but because of timing. And what I want to kind of point out is that in the 1970s, there were a kind of a large contingent of Afro-Asian Jews, mostly youth in their 20s, even teenage age, who started what's called the Israeli Black Panthers. And during this time, they were fairly successful for several years, even forming a political party. During the same period of time, there were a lot of Moroccan Jews who actually wanted to go back to Morocco, and this kind of back to Africa type of movement that was going on. It's rarely talked about nowadays, but I found lots of evidence of it. And during one interview with a kind of well-known Israeli newspaper, the reporter asked them, well, why are you leaving? And this random guy in the street, said, we've had enough of this country. 28 years we put up with you, Ashkenazim, meaning, white European origin Jews. And then we didn't become affluent from the riots. And so there were like several different ethnic rebellions going on in the 50s and 70s that the blacks did against the whites. So now we're saying, thanks, that's enough. We're going back to Morocco. And you can hear echoes of this in like what the discourse is in the US for Black Americans as well, right? So that's something that's really kind of important to keep in mind, that although it may not be as well known, there's a lot of kind of very similar issues going on in play in terms of racial dynamics in Israel and the US. And I'll end here with something that, I'm definitely going to talk about much later, but I just want to kind of give you a little taste here of Yossi Sabari, who is a stand-up comedian and a slam poet, also used to be a dentist. And he writes some really powerful poetry on the question of Blackness, race, gender expression, sexuality, all kinds of things, and migration as well. He has two poems that I found powerful. I'm going to share one that's called If I Were Ethiopian. And here he's kind of, noting that for him, he's a Yemenite origin Jew whose family migrated to Israel in the 1940s. So for him, he's always been the Black one in that sense. In the 1990s, there was a large contingent of Ethiopian Jews who migrated to Israel, and they became the Blacks of the Jewish population in some sense. And so there is a little bit of tension that you can see, at least in this little cartoon here on the left-hand side, where the two people in front are kind of marked as Mizrahi, probably Moroccan Jewish. And they're saying, once we were the oppressed Blacks here until the Ethiopians came and screwed us over. As if there's some kind of, Olympics at play, victim Olympics at play with that. And in the background, you have Ethiopian Jews protesting against racism. So he's kind of playing with that idea that a lot of people kind of bring up, that there is this tension of who are the Blacks, who are the oppressed Blacks amongst the Jewish population. And he points out that, there is a skin color issue at play, right? He's fairly dark, but many Ethiopian Jews are darker. And he ends with this line that I think is so powerful that, because a kid like that, a kid that you would feel sorry for if you saw them on the news or something like that, they need to be white in order to have that sympathy for children like that. And so he says, since I'm not an Ethiopian, it's clear to me that Black isn't a color, it's a status. And he uses a term that can also mean social position, socioeconomic class, and that kind of thing. And I think that's a really powerful, kind of way of thinking about it. Excuse me. And in a similar tone, Adi Kassar, who's also a Yemenite Jewish poet, she has this dialogue between herself and presumably a white Ashkenazi man. And his questioning is all about, okay, well, you can just be successful. This is a post-racial society now. You can be successful if you want to be. Those Afro-Asian Jews who are poor is because they want that. And she notes that, I hear that, money talks, but it has the slang of North Tel Aviv, which is almost all exclusively white in that sense. And his response is, well, everything's black and white to you. And her response is so powerful to me, is that she says, well, you're the one that put these glasses on me. You're the one that kind of framed everything as black and white. And now you want me to ignore that that is the case. So if we play doctor and patient, who's the sick one here? And she notes that, this guy who's arguing that there's a post-racial Israeli society amongst Jews is the sick one, and she's trying to fix it by bringing up and making it explicit that these issues are very important and salient. So I'll conclude on that, and thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. Just a second. Okay. So I would like to open by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very important event. And in this short presentation, I would like to give you a taste of a very small part of my study on Holocaust memory in apartheid South Africa. So on the morning of October 15, 1989, Ahmad Muhammad Kathrada was released from Portsmouth maximum security prison near Cape Town. A South African Indian veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle, treason trialist, and long-serving political prisoner, Kathrada had spent 26 years and 3 months in prison, 18 years of which were on Robben Island. Leaving his prison cell, Kathrada carried with him some cardboard boxes containing his most prized belongings. This included 7 notebooks in which Kathrada had secretly recorded inspiring passages he had encountered over the years. In his 3rd notebook, Kathrada recorded 13 entries from the Diary of Anne Frank, which was smuggled onto Robben Island in the late 60s, And on November 2014, I visited the University of Western Cape, Robben Island Mayabuye archives, and located Katwada's prison notebooks. However, it soon became clear to me that Katwada's interest in the Holocaust did not begin with the reading of the diary on Robben Island. In his memoirs, written in 2004, he dedicated a chapter to a formative visit he made to Auschwitz and to the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland in 1951, where he witnessed firsthand the destruction in the aftermath of the Second World War. After reading his memoirs, I realized that I have to meet this man and to learn firsthand of his experiences. And on Friday morning, 11 August 2016, I met Katwada in his apartment in Johannesburg, and he was very keen to share his life story with me. Katwada died 6 months after the interview on 28 March 2017 at the age of 87. And a month after his passing, the Katwada Foundation gave me a free access to his personal archive, where I located transcripts of his political speeches from the early 50s. So by reading together Katwada's statements, speeches, and prison notebooks in conjunction with his own memoirs and personal documents and the interview I conducted with him, I was able to address several questions. What made it possible for Katwada to address Jewish suffering during the Holocaust? What stands behind such invocations of memory and meaning? And how can we see Katwada negotiating between different forms of commemoration and memorialization? To answer these questions, I had to chart Katwada's life narrative, as well as the course of local and global events that led him to this negotiation. And of course, unfortunately, I do not have the time to present the extensive survey that allowed me to investigate Katwada's observations concerning the Jewish genocide and World War II as reflecting a conflict of memories that blend different histories of destruction, suffering, and discrimination together with the brutal reality of apartheid South Africa. But I will try to give you a short glimpse into my research nonetheless. Katwada was born on 21st August 1929 in Schwartz-Reisman, a small Africana rural town about 240 miles from Johannesburg, to a religious Muslim family of Indian descent. And it is important to know that stereotypes of the Indian merchant as dishonest, crafty, and exploitive were prevalent in South African society from the very inception of Indian settlement in the country in 1860. Although anti-Indian legislation had been imposed at regular intervals from the late 19th century, the rise of Afrikaner right-wing proto-fascist organizations over the 30s and 40s provoked violent anti-Indian demonstrations across the country. Local laws of segregation enforced separate schools for separate races. In Schwartz-Reisman, there was a school for Black South Africans and a school for whites. But as an Indian, Katwada could not attend either of them. This political reality forced him to migrate to Johannesburg without his parents when he was only 8. It was there that he was introduced to politics upon joining a non-racial youth club that was ran by the Young Communist League, and later also he also joined the Communist Party of South Africa. And as Katwada noted in his interview, it was at the party's meetings that he acquired deeper knowledge of Nazi Germany and the ongoing tragedy of European Jewry. Katwada testified that the Communist Party's anti-fascist message had a great impact on him, especially in light of the right-wing Afrikaner support for Nazism at the time. Moreover, he asserted that the sights of war he had witnessed 10 years later during a visit to Europe in 1951 reinforced his anti-fascist tendencies. And On 14 June 1951, Kathrada left South Africa for the first time, and he traveled to Hungary, where he settled at the World Federation of Democratic Youth headquarters in Budapest as the head of the African desk. And while in Europe, he was exposed to lingering evidence of wartime destruction. He was invited to participate in the Warsaw meeting of the International Union of Students held in September 1951 and traveled the city and its surrounding in the weeks prior to the event. And during this short period, he also went to see the destructions of the Warsaw Ghetto and Auschwitz concentration camp. And I will only focus on his impression from his visit in Auschwitz. And we should remember that in 1947, the Polish government declared Auschwitz-Birkenau a memorial site at which Poles and citizens of other nationalities fought and died a martyr's death. And the International Auschwitz Committee, comprised of survivors and relatives of victims, was dominated by veterans of the largely communist Auschwitz underground. And this committee decided to turn over the barracks in the original war camp area to 20 countries for use as national pavilions. And only one structure was actually dedicated to the Jewish narrative or the Jewish story, and it was usually locked and only open on special occasions. And as the Jewish killing was forced into the background, the extent of Polish suffering, as well as the role of the heroic liberating Red Army, was foregrounded. Nevertheless, as you can see in this quotation, Kathrada writes of Auschwitz, "I could never obliterate the sites of the trench in which dogs mauled and savaged people to death, the gas chambers and incinerators, the lampshades made of human skin, the pillows stuffed with human hair." He found the concentration camp to be a poignant reminder to mankind of the evils of racism, and was overcome with emotion as he walked on the fragments of human bones littering the street near the incinerators. Kathrada believed that the Holocaust constituted an important lesson for humanity and bore particular relevance for his own country, that he carefully collected a handful of bone fragments, bringing them back to South Africa to serve as stark reminder of racism's consequences. He actually used these bone fragments in his political speeches in the 50s. And if we have one more minute, I will give you one example. So on a winter morning in September 1952, Kathrada stood on the podium at the Trades Hall in Johannesburg, holding a bottle full of human bones he had collected in Auschwitz, and addressed the audience of the ANC Youth League. And he stated, "People are fighting for freedom in the whole world. I was in Europe a few months ago, and there saw a number of human bones lying about the country, bones of Jews that Hitler killed because he accused them of being communists. They were not communists. Milan is now following the example of Hitler by arresting our leaders." So this speech, delivered only a few months after Kathrada went back from Europe, provides an accurate indication of his perception of the Holocaust. On the one hand, he specifically refers to the Jews as Hitler's victims, and simultaneously, however, in noting that Hitler accused the Jews of being communists, Kathrada departs from the Jewish narrative of the Holocaust and implies that Nazi ideology was motivated by anti-communism and not by anti-Semitism, a position more compatible with the Soviet narrative of the war. However, as other addresses made by Kathrada demonstrate, this position enabled Kathrada to draw parallels between Hitler and Milan's policy of invoking the struggle against communism in order to suppress opposition. Indeed, according to statistics held by the Nazis, the most common form of opposition derived from those ideologically opposed to the Nazis, and primarily the communists and the socialists. By comparing between the Nazi Enabling Act of March 1933, which allowed the Nazis to effectively determine who was an opponent, and the Apartheid Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, Katwada pointed to the striking similarity between the two regimes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. Let me see. All right. Professor Bergen invited me to share a little bit about my current research, a project that concerns white nationalist hate mythologies, a mythology that lies snugly at the intersection of Black and Jewish cultural interests. To any student of what we might crudely call old school anti-Semitism, the story isn't new. White nationalist literary subculture resurrects the Jewish cabal of the protocols, slotting in Black people as the enforcers of a diabolical strategy to disempower and culturally annihilate white Gentiles. I started this work in 2018, and as you could probably guess, it's grown less and less necessary for me to convince people that thinking about the spread of white nationalist discourses in the United States and beyond is, in fact, a topic worth discussing. This is my first presentation since the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th, and even in a crowd disinclined to view the rise of hate politics with alarm, someone would be hard-pressed to argue that racialized mythologies of power don't make large groups of otherwise and extraordinary people behave in extraordinarily violent ways. What once seemed to be a preposterous set of apocalyptic tropes in which Jews coordinate the actions of brown, unchristian hordes in an effort to rob good white people of their world is now, for a sizable minority of Americans, simply the true story of the frightening future to come, or worse, the threatened future that's already here. When I was in graduate school, my advisor would reject any claim unless I could, in his words, show how it works on the page. So allow me to use my allotted time to show you how fictions of intersectional hate work on the page. As someone who spends time in these virtual hate spaces with people who connect their advocacy for ethnic uprising to the ideas that motivate this advocacy, I can assure you that racist novels work. The two novels I've chosen to mention here, the Turner Diaries and The Camp of the Saints, are indexical to the canon and bring into relief what I think are the most salient elements of the text central to my research. I'll start with the novel that has been called this generation's Klansmen, an homage to the Jim Crow novel that inspired the iconic film The Birth of a Nation. Beginning as a serialized story, William Pierce's 1978 novel The Turner Diaries is freedom fighter Earl Turner's account of the guerrilla movement known as the Order and its global overthrow of the system, a Jewish-controlled shadow organization that, like the Elders of Zion before it, exists primarily to disenfranchise white Gentiles and redistribute resources and rights in favor of the biologically and morally inferior masses. The Jews commenced their machinations with the Cohen Act, the government's mandated confiscation of civilian firearms. After this, a series of increasingly encroaching laws are enacted, from the criminalization of white self-defense to the comprehensive surveillance of all enemies of the system. Pierce's description of the terrorism required to right the system's wrongs is unsparing. The novel's real denouement takes place on the day of the rope, when the men of Southern California's Division of the Order raid the homes and workplaces of all reported race traitors. Over the course of this day of reckoning, the militia lynches so many system sympathizers that, quote, tens of thousands of grisly forms hang from the lampposts, power poles, and trees throughout the city, each body bearing a placard with the printed legend, I betrayed my race. The Day of the Rope is not the end of the novel, but it represents the capacity of the Order to execute a large-scale operation. More importantly, as the climax, this scene demonstrates at the micro level precisely what sympathizers of the nefarious global system should expect. White people who willingly join the enemy are deserving of the most vicious punishment, and race betrayers should take note that their race will not protect them when the hammer of justice falls. In the end, justice does in fact prevail. The novel's collective enemies are ultimately defeated, and white nationalists not only take back the country, but eventually succeed in a global genocide that cleanses the entire world of the Black and Jewish threat. Early cult followers of the novel organized a real-life white nationalist order using the blueprint set forth in the Turner Diaries to map their own armed revolution against the nefarious power brokers behind the perceived disenfranchising forces of globalization. Its popularity with terrorists like Tom Metzger sparked an FBI memo on the novel, with some concern that the order's imagined bombing of government buildings would come to fruition. History has borne out this concern. And perhaps the most famous example, Timothy McVeigh, who for years had been selling the novel at a loss just to spread the word, had pages from the Turner Diaries in his car on the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, which he had modeled closely on the novel's bombing of the FBI headquarters. In another one of many examples, John William King's 1998 lynching of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, was reportedly inspired by the novel as well, as he was shackling Bird's legs to his truck, readying to drag him 3 miles across unfinished asphalt. King is reported to have told his victim, quote, "We are going to start the Turner Diaries early." In some ways, fiction is an incidental means of examining the rhetorical strategies with which the larger movement has established its increasing power and reach. As someone in the business of parsing the art of words, I have to say that today's white nationalists are contriving their commentary with the care of the most skilled poets. Make no mistake, the people at Breitbart and the Daily Stormer are in the business of creative nonfiction at a scale that rivals the United States' long history of ugly propaganda. The same people who imagine themselves to be opponents of the Jewish system act as citizen journalists for white nationalist hubs like the Daily Stormer and follow a style guide that brings Turner Diaries politics to life. For those who wonder the direction of their vitriol, these excerpts that you're looking at now make it clear: just blame the Jews for everything. Lest the tastes of white nationalists be called provincial, the transatlantic economy of racist ideas that animate white nationalism have made room for The Camp of the Saints, a 1973 novel by Jean Respect. Journalist Paul Schaefer provides a succinct summary of the novel. In 1973, a strange apocalyptic novel imagined France suddenly overrun by hundreds of boats, carrying hundreds of thousands of migrants from the Indian continent. Within 24 hours, as the military response fails, political elites capitulate and the French native population collapses. Poisoned by their pity for other races, the West falls to the Black and brown invasion swarming across its land. In the face of countless ships full of migrants, governments from the Soviet Union through Europe all the way to the United States can't do anything but surrender to the threatening tide. As the novel wraps up, Respect offers a few gasp-worthy symbols of how far the world has truly fallen. These are really fun, guys. In this apocalyptic future, the mayor of New York City is forced to share his mansion with 3 Black families from Harlem, and the Queen of England is forced to marry her son to a Pakistani woman. And with a total lack of irony, the author describes the breach of apartheid South Africa's sovereign borders by millions of presumptuous Black Africans looking to threaten the country's rightful colonial government. How's that for humor? The Camp of the Saints has been revived by the so-called alt-right in the United States and recovered by France's National Front, with sales tied to growing European anxieties around the influx of asylum seekers from Muslim-majority countries. It is perhaps unsurprising, given the National Front's reputation, that current party leader and former presidential candidate Marine Le Pen has recognized the novel as an eloquent warning of the, quote, migratory submersion threatening all that is good with the French way of life. It may also be unsurprising to those familiar with Breitbart News, a self-named white nationalist media source, that its former executive chairman, Steve Bannon, would celebrate the novel as predictive of Europe's current migrant invasion, in his words. This ideological common denominator is behind Bannon's unusual invitation to the National Front's 2018 Congress. Republican commentator Linda Chavez describes precisely what is surprising about all of this. The novel, in her words, is shockingly racist, and to have the counselor to an American president and the architect of that administration's immigration policy see this novel as one of his touchstones is deeply troubling. Often, for people resistant to the uptick in white nationalist discourse, what superficial insights we have into white nationalist subculture are limited to photos of white supremacist rallies and a prevailing commiseration over a global race politics for which hatred of Blacks and Jews is an export of socio-political utility for far too many state leaders and far too many halls of government. But in this virtual space, ours, where thoughtful people of Africana and Jewish studies meet one another, I hope it inspires more practical scholarly questions. To start with, how can Jewish and Africana studies work across disciplines to excavate a single rhetoric of violence, a cross-racial narrative of shared villainization that drives white nationalist violence? In the plainest and most urgent of terms, this means asking, how can we ensure that we understand intersectional ideologies of hate better than the people who preach them? If you remember nothing else about my current research, recall that it's premised on the belief that where Blacks and Jews are concerned, a shared existential fate relies on our willingness to ask and answer these very questions. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody. I am the last presenter. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint slide right now. And let me see. Okay, hopefully that is working. I'm going to be talking about my forthcoming book and my research on the history of Black musicians in Germany and Austria in the 19th and 20th centuries. Right, a few words before I get started. I'm a German historian by training. And also my friends jokingly call me an honorary musicologist, which is also sort of true. And so what I'll be talking about in particular is how I've turned to the disciplines of musicology, sound studies, and also German Jewish studies to make sense of my research. So without further ado, I'll get started. And actually something that Danielle showed is going to, you'll see a sort of similar thing pop up, I think, in today's presentation. So to get started, about 1 million people in Germany and Austria today identify as Black, actually over 1 million, I learned, representing about 1% of the population. And that number might seem small, but it's actually the same percentage as the number of German Jews in Germany in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power. So in other words, it's important to remember it's not simply only about numbers, it's about visibility, it's about presence. There was, for the first time ever in 2018, the EU released its first ever report on the status of Black people in Europe. And some truly horrific numbers popped out about that, including that in the population that identified as Black in Austria, which is where I grew up, 52% reported that they'd been publicly harassed on public transportation. 2/3 of people of African descent reported an experience of racist vitriol or violence in the last 5 years as well. So German-speaking Europe then has struggled to confront its role in the creation and maintenance of racial hierarchies across what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. And this denial continues to have consequences for Afro-German communities who are fighting to not only end racial discrimination, but also to dispel this belief or this myth that being Black and German is somehow a contradiction. So although we now recognize the long history of German anti-Semitism, scholars and others have been more reluctant to pay attention to anti-Black racism on German-speaking soil. But since the 1980s, which is what this image here shows you on the left, there's been this growing Afro-German movement spearheaded by figures such as the Black lesbian feminist poet Audre Lorde and Afro-German poet Mai Ayim, who have called for recognition as being both Black and German. And one of the things that I do in my work, and one of the things I'm committed to, is pushing back against this idea that Black people in Germany are a more recent contemporary phenomenon, which then ignores this long history of Black diasporic migration to Germany and Austria over centuries. In general, our contemporary discourses explain them as current manifestations of globalization as immigrants and outsiders, thus reinforcing this assumption that Black people lack the connection, historical connection, to claim European identities or truly be European citizens. Afro-Germans, though, actually have been declaring themselves German since at least 1919, even if at the same time many white German-speaking institutions have refused to recognize them as such. So there's this Black German paradox, in other words, right, that's constantly at work in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, right, this paradox of like, you can't be Black and German. What my research does is consider how musical performance plays a role in this. And so what I'm interested in particular with my research with this book that's coming out in the fall, or what I show, is how Black performances of Germanness are constantly exposing this sort of Black German paradox. And they're constantly dismantling this racist tie of Germanness to whiteness in particular at the same time. So my book looks at musicians in the 19th and 20th centuries. They're all classical musicians, I should emphasize that, mostly from the United States, Latin America, the Caribbean, and some from within Germany and from within Europe. You know, musicians who rose to fame and prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, singing the most canonical pieces or performing the most canonical pieces of classical music. So quite literally the music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Their musical performances, I argue, I've got more images here, their musical performances, I argue, had the power to render racial and national categories malleable or fluid. So Black performances of a Mozart piece or a Beethoven piece or Brahms suggested that identity was not a stable category passed down genetically, but were rather transmutable through the very act of performance. And that Germanness, in other words, is something that could be mastered through performance and through study, and rather than being inherited biologically through whiteness. So in the concert hall or opera house, Black people musically performed both Blackness and Europeanness, collapsing these different categories of Blackness and whiteness, foreignness and Germanness and race and culture. The thing to watch out for, though, and this is where I'm speeding through everything, the thing to watch out for, though, here is German reception. White audiences responded to these performances by shoring up hegemonic boundaries on European soil anew. So musical reception reveals that listeners constantly policed the boundaries between Blackness and whiteness in the concert hall. Across political eras, even amidst competing political ideologies, white, German, and Austrian listeners consistently participated in the practice of racial listening, one that relegated Blackness as alien and foreign, as far removed from German culture as possible, even when their own ears are contradicting that fact. So their refusal, and this is where I thought of Danielle's image, so on the left here, you have this artist, this Black artist who made these t-shirts, right, of comments he'd received from white Germans over the years. And so like, and when do you go back, right, implies that like he doesn't belong there. So white Germans' refusal to recognize or to accept Black performances of Germanness provides more evidence to what one scholar, Priscilla Lane, has argued, which is that in the 20th century in Germany, Blackness is posited as always already outside of German culture and in opposition to German culture, foreclosing the possibility of being Black and German. So to get to this idea of this, listening to Blackness, whiteness, Germanness in all of these different ways, what I turned to in particular was theories of listening that have been developed by historians, musicologists, and sound studies scholars over the last decade, and their work fundamentally rejects the assumption that listening is a universal objective experience, namely that listeners all hear the same sounds the same way. Rather, they argue, listening has historically functioned as a method of social boundary drawing. Audiences listen along racial lines, drawing from pre-existing racial vocabularies and systems of knowledge to contextualize the sounds that they hear. So over time, audiences have learned how to listen for Blackness and use sounds they code as Black and white, which brings me to the book that you see here on the right, The Sonic Color Line by Jennifer Lynn Stover, that's her whole thing, is figuring out like, how does this process of racial listening work? So this practice of racial listening, she argues, at least for her work in an American context, it begins in earnest in the 19th century, and it made it possible for white audiences to see themselves as the arbiters of taste, citizenship, and personhood. What in particular has helped me to make sense of this practice of boundary drawing is scholarship in musicology on German Jewish musicians and composers. In particular, work on the 19th century composer Richard Wagner and his infamous treatise on Judaism and music. And as you can see here from this language, from this terrible treatise that I'm sure many people perhaps already know, we see already in the 1850s this idea of hearing race, of hearing, that Jews supposedly speak differently, they sound different, right? That's the idea. And then in terms of, at least for me, the work of scholarship that first drew my attention to this was K.M. Knittel, a musicologist who unfortunately passed away in 2012 really suddenly. And she published a couple articles that I read before her book came out, in which she looks at sort of reception of the composer Gustav Mahler and anti-Semitism in fin de siècle Vienna, and argues that the listening experience is not and can never be a neutral one. Like any other perception, it is structured not only by our backgrounds and experiences, but also by our preconceived ideas. And she noticed that in how people were talking about Gustav Mahler and also visually portraying him as well. So, in this, a bunch of different anti-Semitic cartoons saying that his music sounds noisy, it sounds strange, here are some animals, that are coming out of this, right, and the like. So that's been really helpful for me. And so then what I was able to do using some of this framework was think about how we see people here, how we see white people hear Blackness and whiteness in Central Europe when it came to Black classical musicians who, again, are performing like Brahms and Schubert and things that supposedly have nothing to do with Blackness or whiteness. It's supposed to be free from any kind of racial connotation. It's supposed to be universal music. And so we see it work in a couple of different ways. So in terms of this, how they listen to race, if white audiences liked how Black musicians performed, how they sang Schubert or how they sang Hugo Wolf or others, they would call them quote unquote Negroes with white souls. Negroes with white souls, which suggested that their dedication to classical music had, like, through their dedication, these Black musicians had overcome their Blackness and the supposedly, like, the limitations it supposedly posed. So that's one way that we see it. It's sort of praising them as Negroes with white souls. And so in doing so, in calling and in praising and elevating Black musicians in this manner, it often meant whitening them. On the other hand, if audiences rejected a performance, they usually rejected it because they claimed that it sounded too Black. Again, even though they're singing Schubert or whatever, right? So we see it in a bunch of different ways. They rely on biological notions of the body, of Black body. So their voices sound guttural, they sound dark and smoky, they sound quote unquote Negroid. This is from a review of Aubrey Pankey, a baritone in Salzburg in the 1930s. So they're somehow incapable of sonically producing Germanness, right? They can imitate it, but they can never actually produce it themselves. Okay, I see, yes, timing. So, and then in addition to racializing Black voices, what we then also see is relying on sort of notions of Black authenticity and the like, which I can get into later. And the last point I'll end on really quickly is that Afro-Germans have then borne the brunt of this bifurcation of Blackness and whiteness, and that their biographies indicate that far too often white German listeners determine the validity of a Black person's performance still along these kinds of racial lines. So I have all kinds of examples I can share later from Marie Nehar of like trying to go to a bank and ordering a money transfer and someone saying like, how do you speak such good German? And this is in Hamburg in the 1940s. And she says, well, German is my mother tongue. And then like the white lady says, that's impossible. You're not of German stock, right? So these kinds of lines that we see over and over again. I will leave it there, and yes, and we'll talk more later.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for these like really wonderful, scintillating presentations. And now we're going to turn to our second round, which is shorter, and we're actually going to reverse the order. So Professor Thurman, when you said see you later, later is coming very soon, because what we asked our panelists to do in the second round is to kind of like reach out to us, our graduate students in our program, humor and hope in any way that they wanted, from the basis of basically what they're doing and thinking about right now. So we're just going to reverse order, which means Professor Christmas, Dr. Mikel Arieli, and Professor Roby.
Okay, so I go first. I will share my screen again, so you can see what I have next, which is thinking about resilience and hope. And that one of the things I thought I would emphasize is the thing I find really fascinating is thinking about how we see German Jewish, in particular German Jewish and African American collaboration across the 19th and 20th centuries in the world of music. And so this book, Minor Transnationalism, was really helpful for me for thinking about this, about how minorities come together to think, across national lines in the spirit of collaboration. The field of Black internationalism has also been really helpful for me, thinking through a lot of these questions of how Black people have looked beyond their own borders to find collaboration and people who are willing to work with them on to create political freedom. And so that can include all kinds of different categories. It's not just simply Black people working with other Black people. It can be all kinds of different ways we see, Black and Asian struggles, all kinds of other things. And so in my work, what I've noticed is that we see a lot of German Jewish musicians who really are helpful in creating and supporting the careers of Black musicians. We see it in an American context first, where a lot of the classical musicians that I look at, like Scott Joplin, who's famous for ragtime, right, and things like that, had studied with German Jewish immigrants. And so in particular, I can talk about Scott Joplin and Julius Weiss, that they had a very close relationship, and that Scott Joplin supported Julius Weiss towards the end of Weiss's life financially for over a decade. So they had a very close relationship, and that we see this as well when and so we see oftentimes, or in my book, I find these different kinds of calls from German Jews to African Americans in the States saying, come to Europe, come to Germany. I mean, this is before the Nazis, right? But like, come to Germany, and that here you can have the career that you can't have in America because of institutional racism in America that doesn't allow you to perform, at the Metropolitan Opera House or the New York Philharmonic or things like that. So this is one example. There's also Anna Nussbaum, who was a German Jewish socialist as well, who was good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois and worked together on a whole manner of issues. And then, at least in ways I see it in my work, Bruno Walter, the conductor in the 1930s who conducted the Vienna Philharmonic after he kicked out by the Nazis in Berlin, he was at the Berlin Philharmonic, was really adamant about working with Black musicians. This was an ideological position for him as much as it was a musical one. So he worked with Roland Hayes, he worked with Marian Anderson, he worked with a pianist named Josephine Harold, and so we see these kinds of transnational networks over time. And the last example I'll give is a friendship of Annie Schnitzler, who was the daughter of Arthur Schnitzler, and Roland Hayes, who became really good buddies in the 1920s. This relationship worked both ways in that she supported his career, of course, in Germany and functioned as a concert manager at various times for him. But then also, Roland Hayes introduced her to the writings of Alan Locke and other figures from the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement in particular. And so these are their letters that I found in the Detroit Public Library, in which she thanks him for mailing her a copy of the New Negro, and is talking about really being blown away by it. He also sends her copies of County Cullen's poetry, and says that also that she's really blown away by it and thinking about how this could work as art songs, which is really interesting. So I will leave it at that so that other people can share. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
was such a great answer. I feel less prepared to give an equally good answer. So this is my much less formal answer. I don't have any slides, but I can say this. When I read the title for the conference, the theme, I was a little concerned. When you work on violent hate fiction, it doesn't inspire a lot of resilience humor. You know, I am always the bummer at the cocktail party, so I'm probably a little bit the bummer here. Yeah, so it makes it feel a little ironic to think about finding a way to look for resilience, humor, and hope in doing this work. It did, however, as I was thinking about what to say, bring to mind the first day of a graduate course that I taught on lynching literature and culture. A new graduate student stayed after class just to tell me this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. He told me I was remarkably cheerful given how much time I spend amid first-person accounts of lynchings and collected photographs of lynched bodies. I was a little taken aback and equally charmed. In the moment, I told him that I'd be as miserable as possible if that would in any way undo the atrocities I read and write about on a daily basis. But since no person will have their safety and dignity restored by my performance of seriousness, even if I could do that, and no ideologies of violence and hate will be undone by my own unrestrained outrage, however righteous it may be, I choose levity. I'm not in favor of humor for its own sake, forcing a smile as I catalog some fiction of atrocity based on a true story. I choose to focus on the joy of this intellectual enterprise because it is an exercise in hope grounded in my perhaps unintellectual faith that digging through this distasteful archive is a means to some constructive healing end, however modest its impact. On a panel like this, when my peers are answering a shared question, I can't help but wonder, when formulating my own answer, how it will compare. Will my colleagues have some sophisticated account of how to theorize resilience and humor? Professor Thurman shows that they will. But the best I can do is this. Spending hours mired in racist, violent discourses and imagery is not for the faint of heart. And I don't think it's a reach to say that it's much harder for those of us who are the subjects of white nationalist fantasists. How can I voluntarily encounter journalism and novels every day that would subject my brown female body to every form of explicit degradation, shared in vivid detail? I can do this work because my intellectual insights, I believe, are stronger than their uncritical fury, and because no matter how much they'd like me to be demoralized by the relentlessness of their efforts, I won't let them have my smile and I will not surrender my hope. Whatever corner of the academic landscape you graduate students find yourself in, I encourage you to equally defend your levity against those who would claim that projecting earnestness and exploring meaningful ideas are the same thing. In fields where we often have every reason to stop smiling, it's an act of bravery to retain a sense of humor in the face of intellectual rigor. If you're doing it right, you'll undoubtedly run across any number of absurdities that can't help but strengthen your laughing muscles in the meantime.
Okay, I'll go back to my slides. And I will stay with Ahmed Kathrada for my answer. And as I mentioned earlier, Kathrada was a political prisoner of the apartheid regime. He was caught by the police on a police raid on Lilisley Farm near Johannesburg in July 1963, together with 11 other activists. And these arrests led to the infamous Rivonia trial, held in June 1964, in which 8 defendants were each charged with 2 counts of sabotage and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. And the Black prisoners landed on Robben Island on 13 June 1964 to begin their life sentence. And for Kathrada, it would be almost 27 years before he would finally be free. It was during the late 60s at the maximum security prison that Kathrada first learned of the Diary of Anne Frank. And in an interview he gave in 2008 to Tim Cousins, he stated, Anne Frank made an immediate impact on me personally. Of course, as people read that, it made an impact on all of the prisoners who read Anne Frank. there was a similarity, although Anne Frank's position was much worse than ours. But there was a similarity. She was being persecuted with her family because she was Jewish, and Jews were persecuted tremendously. And I think that this statement is essential for understanding Katwada's reading of the diary of Anne Frank on Robben Island as a means of articulating his own position as a political prisoner of the apartheid regime. It expresses his recognition of Anne Frank's Jewish identity and of the particular and unique circumstances of the Holocaust. The emphasis he places on the differences between the historical circumstances in which he lives and those of Anne Frank is critical in marking the particularity of the Holocaust, and it allows Katwada to mark the diary as an inspiration for his own struggle without blurring or distorting the unprecedented historical events of the Holocaust. And I think this is a good way to relate to the conference theme, resilience, humor, hope, by focusing on Katwada's individual reading of the diary. I won't give you an example from the 13 quotations, but I will say that his prison notebook, which served as a diary of diaries during the 60s, provides a glimpse into his individual reading of the diary as a mirror of his own experiences, insights, and beliefs, although it's not his own words that he's writing in the notebook. Most of the quotations from the diary that appears in the prison notebook can be interpreted as forging imaginative links between his experience of political imprisonment while isolated on Robben Island and the experiences of a Jewish young girl in hiding in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. Anne Frank's endurance while in hiding and her emphasis on the importance of remaining optimistic even under the worst circumstances appears as recurring themes in Katwada's recorded entries. And the entries invite us to reconsider the importation of the term annex specific to Anne Frank's experience into the context of apartheid, and more specifically of Katwada's experience of imprisonment in the Robben Island cell. Thank you.
Just realized I was muted. Okay. So, yeah, like Danielle, I struggled with the idea of humor. You know, Kira can also attest to this, that I'm quite a bummer when I talk about research and race, and a little bit of a pessimist as well. So the thing that kind of popped in my head, I provided a picture on the right-hand side just because non-Israelis would not really know who this person is. But there's this really funny poem by Yossi Sabari that's an ode to Matan Khodorov, who's pictured here at the top. This is Yossi Sabari. And Matan is this TV presenter who is an economist and takes a fairly neoliberal approach to all kinds of things. And Yossi Sabari is the opposite of that. And it's quite funny how he does it. He talks about, you know, oh, how he longs for Matan's, you know, pale, fat belly that will be interspersed with his own skinny brown legs and things like that. So I always find that fairly humorous. And what he's doing there is something that he does often, which is actually defining whiteness, which is often, you know, it rarely is the case that people like explicitly define whiteness. And there's this other poem in which Yossi Sabari does, which is called I Always Wanted to Be White, or Ashkenazi, where he like very explicitly in detail defines what whiteness is for Israeli Jews. And it's, you know, classical music, good wine, the culture of Vienna, and not the wretchedness of the East, whatever that means. And throughout this poem, he talks about how he's like this, similar to what Kira pointed out, he's kind of like this white soul trapped in a black or brown body, in a sense. He repeatedly like refers to this phrase and then looks to people later on who have a kind of vice versa issue, in which there's one Ashkenazi man who feels as if, you know, he's trapped in a white body, but really has a Mizrahi soul in that sense. And in defining whiteness and blackness throughout this poem, he gets into things that, you know, are somewhat discomforting, but really important to point out as something that is oftentimes done within global blackness for stereotypes in a sense. So he says, alas, my bad luck, destiny wanted that I would be born a curly-haired Mizrahi, a wretched toddler who's intended to suffer from dark brown skin and being thin as a stalk, with a small brain, but a penis that is huge. A lot of this rhymes in Hebrew. I don't want to go through, you know, how it works out, but what he's pointing to there is like this kind of, you know, sense, globally speaking, that Black men are like hypersexual and things like that. You know, a lot of themes that we can see that are you know, quite prominent within the U.S. case for Black bodies in particular. And a foolish imbecile possessing potential to become at best a port worker, which is oftentimes something that Mizrahim in the South do. And so kind of tying that in with humor, but also resilience. And what I would like to say is that when I think about it, although I'm fairly pessimist in a lot of different ways, it's important to note that some people's existence and survival in that sense is a lot harder to maintain than others. And the fact that people just exist, a lot of times Black bodies and Black people exist, is like a sign in itself of resilience. So yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you all. I'm sure that everyone has many questions they want to ask. I wish we could like applaud in some, you know, thunderous way, but we can't because we're on the screen. So instead, I'm going to say a huge and warm thanks. Please take a 5-minute break, everyone. Gather your questions, gather your thoughts, do what you need to do. Come back in 5 minutes, and our colleague Yu Wang will lead us through the discussion and question and answer. Thank you all.